Hi everyone, my name is Raffi. I'm a Chem 1T7 and I am the Chief Returning Officer for this 1T5-1T6 academic year. The Chief Returning Officer is responsible for facilitating and holding all Engineering Society elections, and we use STV, which is single transferable vote, to elect our representatives, and I'm going to show you in this video how it works. Okay, so now that you have a brief history of how EngSoc does its elections and what elections are coming up, I'm going to explain to you how votes are calculated for Engineering Society. So it uses an STV, which is single transferable voting system, which is a proportional representation system of voting where it's based on a ranked ballot. So like many other conventional elections, there is obviously a threshold needed to be elected, which is the quota, the number of votes needed to win a seat in a given election. And it is calculated based on this formula, which takes into account the number of votes and the number of seats. So what happens when somebody does get elected? Well, the beauty of proportional representation is that their votes are not exhausted, but redistributed based on this formula. And this formula takes into account the present value of the vote when elected and the difference between the quota and the number of votes when the candidate was elected. And I'll explain how that works in an example election to give you a better understanding. Alright, great. So now that you've received a crash course in STV and the basics of it, I'm going to take you through an actual election to show you and reinforce the concepts of how STV works. So let's take an example election of these candidates where there were 10 votes and there are 4 seats up for grabs. So the quota, based on that formula that I showed you earlier, would be 10 divided by 4 plus 1 plus 1, and that equals out to 3. What this number is effectively saying is that in order to be elected to one of the 4 seats, you need to either reach at a minimum 3 votes or exceed it. So now let's take a look at the first round of voting. So in the first round, we simply look at the first place candidates for each of the 10 ballots and distribute them accordingly. So here you can see Jack has 1, Tom has 2, Ron has 2. So that means Jack has 1 first place, Tom has 2 first place, etc., etc. So the first question that STV asks in an election is, have any of the candidates reached or exceeded quota? And if you actually look here, we can see that James has indeed exceeded quota. He has 4 votes, the quota is 3. So what happens? Well, the beauty of proportional representation is that these votes are not just simply exhausted, but redistributed based on a formula. And this formula is W is equal to the present value of each of the ballots, which is simply 1, times the difference between the total number of votes when elected, subtracted by the quota, divided by the total number of votes when elected. And if you apply this formula to this situation, you actually get that each ballot is now worth a quarter, which makes perfect sense. So let's take, for example, 3 of those ballots for which James was first place. You can see here that these 2 are identical and this one is the same. So what STV does is it eliminates James from first place, since he was elected, and it looks at the next spot in the ballot. So here Joe was second place for 2 of the ballots, and Tom was second place for 1 of the ballots. So since each ballot is worth a quarter, Joe receives 2 quarter ballots, and Tom receives 1 quarter ballot. And if you look at the next round of voting, you see exactly that. You see Joe has half, Tom has 2.25, which is more than 2, and Jack, who received the 4th and second place, was 1.25. Great. So again, STV asks itself, has anybody reached quota or exceeded it? And the answer is no. Now we have to eliminate candidates now, because in order to be elected, the only way to be elected is to reach or exceed quota, because every candidate is held to the same threshold. So Joe, since he has the least amount of votes, gets eliminated. So since Joe received 2 quarter ballots, we now look at the next person on those 2 quarter ballots. So Joe gets eliminated, and we see that Tom was 3rd place in both ballots. So now Tom receives those 2 quarter ballots, which Joe had received before. And as you can see, that's exactly what happens. Tom has 2.75 as opposed to 2.25. And again, STV asks the question, has anybody reached or exceeded quota? Nope. Well then, we eliminate the person with the least amount of votes, which is John. So, now what happens? John received 1 first place vote. So again, we just do the same thing we did before and look at the next person on the ballot, and we see that that person is actually Ron. Now if you see, Ron has 3 votes, he's reached quota, he wins a seat in the election. However, what Ron actually means is that Ron is reopened nominations, meaning that if you vote for Ron, you believe that none of the other candidates are effectively the best candidates to win the seat. So since Ron won, the remaining seats are now up for grabs because the student body has favored reopening nominations as opposed to the other candidates, and the remaining 3 seats are held for a by-election. I hope that this video has enabled you to understand how STV works and how EngSoc uses it, and if you have any questions, feel free to visit elections.school.ca or email me at cro@school.ca.